I think one of the problems lies precisely in thinking about this entire predicament as climate change. Because climate change is like a sort of it's kind of a discourse that's surrounded by actually quite tall walls. I mean, the whole climate change discourse essentially comes out of Western universities, Western think tanks, and so on and so forth. And they made climate change into a kind of field of expertise, where it's a sort of expertise related to science, related to technology, and so on. And I think this, in turn, creates a very profound gap or misunderstanding, if you like. So, in the West, climate change is perceived as a sort of scientific and technological issue, So if you talk to the average informed Westerner and say what is climate change, I mean, they'll always respond by saying, it's a technological problem, it's a question of shrinking your carbon footprint and that sort of thing. If you go anywhere in the global south and talk about climate change, you get a completely different response. Whether it's in India, China, Indonesia, wherever you go. If you talk to people about climate change, the first thing they'll say is climate change is a problem that's created by the affluent countries. They got rich by colonizing us while we were poor and weak. They consumed enormous quantities of the world's resources. Now it's our turn. This you'll see all the time, everywhere. So, within the global south, it's not seen as a scientific and technological problem. It's seen first and foremost as a geopolitical problem. So, I think this creates a fundamental sort of gap of perceptions. So that even when Western writers are writing about climate change, they think that, a day will come when let's say people in India or somewhere else, because of heat waves or whatever, they'll rise up against the fossil fuel industry. What they don't understand is that will never be the case. I mean, I've been in India right now in the middle of this record-breaking heat wave. But the last thing that people's anger was directed towards was the fossil fuel industry. So, in the end, if people in the global south rise up, what is much more likely is that they will attack maybe the US or the Canadian embassy, not the fossil fuel industry, because they see this already. For them, it's a geopolitical issue. It's not fundamentally an issue of technology. So, I think even when you look at the dystopic imaginings that come out of Western science fiction, I think they're based on a profound misunderstanding of the nature of this crisis. This is ultimately a crisis between human beings. It's not a crisis between humans and nature, as they seem to think. There's a French economist, Jacques Dupuy. He's a philosopher, economist, etc. And he writes in one of his books, do humans harm nature because they hate nature? And he says, no, that's not why they harm nature. They harm nature because they hate each other. And sadly, I think that's actually the case. Yes, but what I would say there is that we have to remember that placing the human at the center of stories really happens with the inauguration of modernity, with the inauguration of a certain kind of thinking that really is born in Europe in the 17th century. Because if you look at narratives before that, whether in Europe or elsewhere, they were always, the human was never exclusively at the center. I mean, if you look at the Iliad, the Odyssey, and so on, there are so many kinds of non-humans, in those stories. And that's been the case everywhere. it's only the rise of modernity that marginalized, these other voices. I don't know if you saw my Lectio Magistralis, which was published yesterday in La Stampa.
No?
Yeah, well, have a look at that. I mean, I make this argument at some length over there. That really, what is ultimately the great challenge that faces writers today is that of giving voice to the non-human. Because there's no one else who can do this. Only writers can do it because economists and historians can't do it because of the nature of their work. Only writers have the license, as it were, to do this, and writers have ignored this duty. Through this whole period of modernity, when non-human voices came to be completely, as it were, marginalized. Though there were some writers who even then were struggling to maintain that. That sense of the non-human. I think mostly of Melville. If you think of Moby Dick, it's very much a book about non-human agency. So I think it's very, very important that writers rise to this challenge because nobody else can. And I think it's happening. Because of my books, I get sent so many manuscripts. I literally like 2 a day. They say, your work inspired me, so now you have to read my book, which isn't always possible. Richard Powers, I think, is a very good example. But there are so many people working in that direction today. There's a very good young writer, British writer. She's actually British Indian. Her name is Laleen Paul, and she's written a wonderful book called A Pod. Yeah, it's about a pod of whales. Very interesting book. There are several others who are writing in this vein. I can't offhand recall all their names, but I think you will see more and more of that. Because it's just necessary. And also because those structures of modernity are so visibly collapsing around us that it's almost become impossible to maintain the pretense that the humans are completely dominant or whatever, because really we are not.